400 years prophecy correction of Genesis 15:13. This correction must be said, so that the truth may stand above all. Explaining the Scriptures. So, here it is. Many are still under the belief that Genesis 15:13 and 14 400 years prophecy is speaking about this day and age, 1600 through 2019, it is not. Again, Genesis 15:13 and 14 is not for our time in history here today. So why am I saying this? The problem is this: the lack of understanding and truly taking notice of Genesis 15 verse 16, the book of Numbers 21:24 and 25 and 31 and the book of Jasher. These verses, Genesis 15:16, Numbers 21:31, and the book of Jasher is the key to understanding Genesis 15:13 and 14. I will get to the point and then explain more in details. So then, what time in history is this 400 years prophecy speaking of? Side note, certainly, the children of Israel were not enslaved or lived in Egypt 400 years, but only lived there 215 years. Answer: this is the time from around the life of Isaac, up until around the time of Numbers 21:31, and even in Exodus 12:40 and 41. Now the explanation. Notice in Genesis 15:16 it is stated, in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the crookedness, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Again, notice. Fourth generation. And notice they, the children of Israel, shall return here. And again, also notice the people called Amorites. In the book of Numbers chapter 21:24 and 25 it is stated, Israel took possession of the land of the Amorites. In Numbers 21:31 it is stated, so Israel lived in the land of the Amorites. This is now the prophecy of Genesis 15:16 being fulfilled. So then, if the prophecy of Genesis 15:16 is fulfilled in Numbers 21:31, then Genesis 15:13 and 14, therefore, cannot speak of this time, our time in history. Generation. Now we look more into the word generation. The Hebrew word is dara. It seems there is no precise definition that we have now in history. However, we all understand it relates to time periods and a race of people in this or that time period. The next generation of children to be born can start at many different time periods through many years by many different parents or brothers and uncles. For example, one brother has his first child 25 years after his oldest nephew was born, and another brother has his children 25 years after that. This is a new generation of children, cousins, with the oldest being 50, the next 25 and the youngest under 1. This is the next generation, the first cousins of any age. This is a generation. So again, a generation is not a precise time, but speak of the children that are cousins born under their fathers that are brothers. The next group of children from brothers. Now we go back to Genesis 15. In verse 13 we read 400 years. And in verse 16 we read in the fourth generation. In Galatians 3:16 and 17 it is very clear that the time from the promises spoken to Abraham, to the time of what was spoken to Moses, was 430 years. I am certain we can fit 4 generations of cousins and uncles of many ages inside these 430 years. Again, it states in Genesis 15:16, in the fourth generation. It does not give a precise time. But okay. We see that Genesis 15:13 does state 400 years, and even states afflicting 400 years. Remember I stated this affliction started at the time from around the life of Isaac, and that the prophecy was completed at the time of Numbers 21:31. The affliction was 400 years, but the promises spoken to Abraham was 430 years. From Abraham to Moses, Galatians 3:16 and 17, 430 years. Abraham was spoken to in Genesis 15 long before his son Isaac was born. It was stated that Abraham's seed, that is Isaac, and the children to come would be sojourners or strangers in the land, and afflicted, and would serve. Isaac, Jacob and the 12 sons and their children were all sojourners in the lands. They were all afflicted by other nations, and they all served in some way or another, because of the other nations around them. Now we read the explanation of these words sojourners, afflict, and serve. Notice in Genesis 15:13 we see these words. Sojourners or strangers. Serve. And afflict. These words must be defined to understand Genesis 15. 1. Sojourners H 16:16. There has been 7 different Hebrew words translated to strangers. This Hebrew word in Genesis 15:13 is gara. Defined as a guest, a foreigner, an alien, a stranger and a sojourner. Therefore, understand that the land was not given to Abraham or any of his children until the time of Moses, and more so Joshua. So then, from Abraham until Moses' freeing of the children in the time of Joshua, they were all guests, foreigners, aliens, strangers and sojourners in all the lands where they were, or went. 2. In a land that is not theirs. No land was truly given to the children Yisrael, until after the 40 years in the wilderness and the time of Joshua. 3. Serve, H 56:47. This is a key word to understand. This word speaks of working, laboring, dress, till, to do, or doing something in a stressful way. The children were serving as slaves in Egypt, but they also lived under stress by the nations around them, before the time of Egypt where they soon traveled, journeyed. Or, in other words, the nations around them made them live, or do things under stress. Jacob's first 10 sons and their servants, had many wars with many nations around them, starting at the time of Genesis 34:1. Also, before the time of slavery in Egypt, the children of Yisrael fought many wars beside the Egyptians as one army. The Hebrew word for serve is ibada, and has been translated to tadil, in Genesis 2:5, serve, in Genesis 15:14, servant, in Genesis 49:15, work, in Exodus 5:18, keep in bondage, in Exodus 6:5, service, in Numbers 4:41, to do, in Numbers 4:47, labor, in Deuteronomy 5:13, aired or plowed, in Deuteronomy 21:4, and dress, Deuteronomy 28:39. Again, this stress of life, and its service with its wars, started at the time of Genesis chapter 34, and Jasher chapter 33. 4. Afflict, H 60:31. The Hebrew word is inahah. Translated to afflict, in Genesis 15:13, dealt hardly, in Genesis 16:6, submit or humble thyself, in Genesis 16:9, defiled, in Genesis 34:2, to humble thyself, in Exodus 10:3, sing, in Exodus 32:18. Forced or force, in Judges 25, weakened, in Psalms 102:23, to be exercised, in Ecclesiastes 3:10, abase, in Isaiah 31:4, ravished, in Lamentations 5:11, chasten, in Daniel 10:12, and troubled, Zechariah 10:2. Genesis 15:13, is telling us, that the children of Abraham would live, and do things in a troubled way, or an afflicted way, caused by the nations around them, before and during the time of Egypt, for 400 years. Isaac was afflicted at the time of Genesis 26:6. Jacob's afflictions came from his uncle Laban, his brother Esau, and the many nations around them that 10 of the sons warred with. And after this, came the time in Egypt. However, they only lived there 215 years. So again, Genesis 15:13 and 14, is not speaking of our time from 1619 to 2019, or any 400 years period in our time. The prophecy of Genesis 15:13 does not end at verse 14, but instead, it ends at verse 16. Numbers 21:31 is the fulfillment and completion of the prophecy of Genesis 15:13, and 14, and 16. I pray this helps in correcting this understanding of the 400-year prophecy. But don't be troubled or worried, for the Messiah is certainly coming very soon. 1 Thessalonians 5:2. For you yourselves know very well, that the day of Yahweh comes as a thief in the night. Please add comments regarding the subject of this explanation. Also, please subscribe to this channel to be notified of many other explanations explaining the scriptures. Thank you for your time. Shalom always.